Hi, I'm Steve Salem, President of the Cal Ripken Senior Foundation.
And I'm Kevin Bingham, Chief Operating Officer of the Cal Ripken Senior Foundation. According to the FBI, each day as many as 150 individuals with criminal records apply for positions with nonprofit organizations, many of whom are registered sex offenders. As an organization that supports the positive development of kids, our most important duty is to keep them safe.
To help us do this, the Cal Ripken Senior Foundation has a zero-tolerance policy for incidents of child abuse. We are committed to working with partners who follow these same principles. In addition, we have worked hard to identify best practices for keeping our children safe and included these concepts in our child protection policy. We recognize that not every organization has a strong child protection policy in place or the resources to develop one, so we are sharing ours.
This guiding template includes key safeguards such as requiring annual background checks on all staff and volunteers, proper notification and reporting procedures for incidents, and training guidelines for your staff and volunteers. Background checks can be expensive, but we should never allow the cost to prevent us from protecting children. On our portal, you will find a link that will provide your organization with access to criminal background checks at a significantly reduced cost. Lastly, an important step to protect kids is education. Our team will participate in ongoing training and encourage you to do the same.
Our first workshop, conducted by Dr. Sharon Cooper, has been made available to you on the portal, and we encourage you to watch. On behalf of the Cal Ripken Senior Foundation, we want to thank you for your dedication to children. It's my pleasure to introduce to you National Child Safety Advocate Robbie Calloway, followed by highlights from our training with Dr. Sharon Cooper. Thank you.
I've been on the Cal Ripken Senior Foundation Board since 2003. It's a distinct honor to have been asked to do it by Cal and Billy and by. I think one of the reasons they asked me to be on the board was that I had experience creating organizations or helping create organizations because I was an original member of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children Board. You know, the issue of child safety, an issue of keeping a child safe in your program is an extremely important issue. If you're a volunteer working with kids, you have every responsibility to do everything possible to make that a good experience for kids. You also have a responsibility to make sure that everybody else is doing the same thing. There are people that want to harm kids. It's a very real issue. It's not something to skirt, it's not something to duck, it's a very real issue. We all want to do the right things for kids, and the right thing is a broader thing. You sometimes have to look at the negatives that could happen, and you want to watch for that. You want to do the right thing by kids, you want to keep the kids safe, and if you do that, then you've given them what they need. You've kept them safe, but you've also helped build their character.
We used to have this term sexual abuse, and that used to encompass everything. But about 1996 or so, we started seeing this issue of internet facilitation of sexual abuse of children. And that's because around 1996, the internet became publicly available. It had been available to the Department of Defense and to universities for years before that time. But once we started having public availability, not only were people using the internet for information gathering, but also they began to recognize that they could network. And I think that's when I first started getting involved with the whole issue of sexual exploitation. Because in the beginning, in the late 90s and the very beginning part of 2000, what we started to see on the internet were people who would talk to each other about their penchants, what they liked. These were networks that started, news groups, where individuals would talk about their favorite pastimes. And this is the first time that we really started reading chat from individuals who had preferential interests in children. We found that there were more than 7,000 news groups at that particular point of people who were talking about how to access children, to sexually abuse them. And just recently this year, in fact, I was interviewed on a television station on a grooming guide that had been found in an investigation involving child sexual abuse. In this particular case, the offender, who had sexually abused several children, was arrested, and when the police went into his home, they found on his computer already printed out in hard copy, a 186-page document that had color pictures every second page of very young, very beautiful, innocent-looking children, and a how-to on how to groom the children and how to groom their families in order to be able to sexually abuse them. This is the classic presentation of a child sexual abuse victim. They do not have a voice. This is very common. Most children who have been sexually abused do not tell you in childhood. That has been studied quite a bit. Boys tell you even less. And I love it when I'm on a witness stand and a defense attorney makes the error of asking me, and so doctor, if this really happened, why didn't they tell? I love for them to ask me that question because then I'll say, well, it'll be very abnormal for a child to make a disclosure because it takes a lot of courage. A lot of times if it's an intrafamilial case, they feel about the ramifications of what's going to happen to my grandfather or my uncle or whomever. Nobody's going to believe me. In fact, offenders often tell victims that no one's going to believe them, or they believe it's their fault, because that's a common, it's referred to as a cognitive distortion in literature. Offenders usually will say when they're talking to law enforcement, well, you know, I really didn't want to do it, but she came and she sat on my lap and I said, no, I want to look at the game. You know, why don't you go back into the other room? She said, oh, no, I want to sit on your lap, and she just made me do it. That's a cognitive distortion that is frequently seen by psychologists who do treatment for sex offenders. So this cognitive distortion on the part of a sex offender is often promoted to the victim. And when the victim is a child, especially a child who's a relation to the offender or an acquaintance, because those are the most common offenders. It's not a stranger who is usually sexually offending a child. It is an acquaintance or a family member who is going to be the most likely offender in that situation, and we have that challenge. So let me define for you what child sexual abuse is. It's any sexual contact with a child where consent is not or cannot be given. Consent is a moot point. And those of us who work with law enforcement understand that really well. Families don't necessarily understand that so well. Looked as if she was not fighting. You know, I've had parents to say to me when I evaluate child sexual abuse victims in one of my clinics, I've had parents to say, well, doctor, I just know it can't be true because when she comes down for breakfast and he's at the kitchen table, she doesn't act like he raped her. You know, that's what mothers have said to me on numerous occasions. And I have to help them understand, well, this is her dad. She loves him, and she wants to be loved by him. And the fact that he has touched her in a way that isn't right and that she knows isn't right doesn't mean she doesn't still love this person. And so therefore you can't just look at a child's behavior from that perspective because they don't always have an aversion to the offender. This includes sexual contact by force or threat of force, regardless of the age of the participants, and all sexual contact between an adult and a child, regardless of whether there's a deception or the child understands the sexual nature of the activity. Now, why this is so important is because when you think about kids who are in youth-serving organizations, not only will you have kids who have been victims who will come into that youth-serving organization, but you will also have kids who are going to be offenders or who have already been offenders that you don't know about in a youth-serving organization. The most frequently cited incidents now of child sexual abuse is 1 out of 3 girls. We used to think 1 out of 4 or 1 out of 5. And 1 out of 7 boys will be sexually abused before they reach the age of 18. And what our knowledge of victimization with respect to child pornography images on the internet has taught us, though, is that 40% of the images on the internet are boys. Remember, all child pornography, pretty much all child pornography, is just a memorialization of child sexual abuse. We are looking at pictures of children being sexually abused. The most common people that we arrest are people who collect, not necessarily people that we know have committed offenses against children. But let me just tell you something. I guess the biggest study that really shook the justice world was a study from a federal prison, Butner, my state, North Carolina, Butner Prison, which at that time had the largest number of convicted collectors of images and who were in sex offender treatment. And the question was asked, okay, you're in prison, you had possession of these images, have you ever committed a hands-on offense against children? And at the onset of their intense treatment, about 186 offenders that they were researching said, yes, well, yeah, maybe one time I did. A total of about 31 victims among these 186 folks. They then had several months of very intense therapy, 15 hours a week of very intense sex offender therapy while they were in prison. And then 9 months later, they were reevaluated. Have you ever committed a hands-on offense against children, and this reevaluation entailed the use of polygraphy as well. So they took polygraphs in the process of that. And that number of 31 victims went up to more than 1,700 victims from these 186 offenders. And so these were people who were caught only as collectors of child pornography. They were never arrested for child sexual abuse, but they admitted to having sexually abused more than 1,500 children in the process. So sometimes when these individuals are collecting, they're collecting as a part of networking with other people who have an interest in children. They have a preferential interest in children. When I talk to parents about their video game behaviors, I try to help parents understand that if you have a video game that's on a DVD, that's a better type of video game for a youth as compared to online. And here's why. On a DVD, the child is playing against the game, you know, and they get to level 5 or they get to level 6, et cetera, and they can either pause it or stop it, and there it is, and then they can go to bed. Because when they come back, you know, they can go back to where they were. And that allows the child to feel, okay, I'm in control of this game. However, the draw of the online world is that when you stop playing, the game continues. And this is what makes it hard for kids and adults to give it up. Because they, in their mind, you know, it's still going on and I just really need to be there. And this is where we have now begun to see offenders who will say, I'm so glad that you made it here to the Far East. Wow, I really want to meet you in the real world. You are the most important, you're the smartest person I ever met. How old are you? You're only 13? Well, you know, I'm just about maybe 26, but age is just a number, and the whole grooming process begins. And it begins with the image of an avatar, not even a real person in front of that child, but they hear that child talking to them every day when they get back online and when they play until 11 and 12 o'clock at night. So we've been beginning to see more and more cases of cyber enticement through video games of kids. What the reality is that most children who've been sexually abused do not go on to offend against other people. That's the first thing to be aware of. Most kids who've been sexually abused go on to be good, upstanding, okay people in life. Those children who do sexually offend may have been victims, and one has to look for that, but they also may have mental health problems. They may have narcissism, or they may have psychopathy, etc. They may have mental health problems as the etiology where they don't care. What we do know about sex offenders in general, whether they're youths or adults, we know that all sex offenders will offend against children more commonly than they offend against adults because children are easier to offend against. In other words, a person who's a sex offender in general will almost always have some children in their past history of having offended against because they can be opportunistic offenders. And this child just happens to be in my space very easy. So a rapist doesn't have to be a pedophile. In other words, they don't have to just only want to have sex with children. They just can access children more readily. Prevention is about the business of becoming educated about something so it doesn't happen to you. You will not be able to prevent something you don't know anything about. So being ignorant about a subject doesn't help you prevent it. It only helps you be ignorant about the subject, so that's not a good thing.